the best of both worlds, Oz people.
Southern songs.
That's the isolated guitar finger picking from the start of I Was Only 19, which my music teacher in first year of high school suggested to me was a great pattern to learn and something in my first performance. Sets a nice, simple pattern leading into the first verse of the song. Interestingly, just for the guitar geeks, this is a much debated chord in Australian iconic song history.
Really?
Based in the key of A major, but strictly that's not an A major chord being played there. It's a suspended second chord.
I thought so.
Yeah, you could hear
it. I thought so.
Unfortunately, some other guitarists play A minor, and that's wrong. So I checked this with John Schumann himself.
Yes.
And thank you very much, John, for participating and contributing to our discussion of this amazing song. He said it is actually a matter of some frustration to him that most people do play A minor. And funnily enough, he said on a number of occasions I've had people try to correct him. The person who wrote the song insisting with the person who wrote the song that it was actually A minor.
Yeah. Oh, that'd be nice, particularly after about 5 beers.
Yeah, coming up to love
the song,
love 19, mate,
right.
But here, you're not playing it right.
Yeah.
And the A-sus chord, in simple terms, it means there's more open strings when you're strumming, and you get this beautiful resonance that lifts us into the first verse and lyric.
Mum and Dad and Denny saw the passing out parade, Puckapunyal. It was a long march from cadets.
Frank, when do you remember hearing this? Or I think you said when you first came to Canberra to work. And
I'd moved from Wollongong, and I was working first year at work, and it was a new time for me, new time politically as well. And this song was pretty new in its style, and the fact that it was alluding to the war, the Vietnam War, but on a very personal basis. And I just remember the word cadets and Puckapunyal, two extremely military references. Puckapunyal, the base in Victoria, military base in Victoria. And cadets is a phenomenon that used to happen in schools, and indeed the high school I went to did have cadets, and I was a member of the cadets. We were issued with military uniforms at the Singleton Army Base in Sydney. And every Wednesday we would don our uniforms and go to school and march in parades and be learnt and taught things military. So it really resonated with me.
But it probably wasn't.
But the idea that it was a long march from cadets.
Yeah.
Cadets is about very young men, very young kids. But this was the real deal.
It's a step up. They were only 19 by the time they expected to be men and soldiers.
Yes.
But that's a big emotional, physical, whatever, step up from being in cadets.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Not a long march.
This was
to
the
a
real
camp
deal
somewhere.
now. This was the real deal.
And it introduces a note of sort of foreboding. Mum and Dad and Denny. Denny is Denise, is John Schumann's wife, the sister of subject of the song, Mick Storen, who was serving in Vietnam. This is a very personal story based around real-life events. It brings that to it in that simple opening. And also, interestingly, where John speaks the phrase, it was a long march from cadets. There's a sort of stylistic element there of very personal talking to the audience. It was a long march from cadets.
Yeah, you see, I interpret that as a very deliberate emphasis, self-emphasis on his part, almost like going inside himself. Oh, God, it was a long march from cadets.
Reflective.
Reflective and saying it instead of seeing it just underscores it, right?
And the 6th Battalion was the next to tour. It was me who drew the card. We did Canungra and Shoalwater before we left.
Geographical references there to parts of Australia, Frank. The idea of drawing the card and the 6th Battalion being the next tour.
Drawing the card, I think that's highly significant. This was a ballot. Remember, these young guys were drawn on a ballot shown on TV, and their lives were going to either change dramatically or they were going to be spared this based on a ballot. And it became very controversial. And so him saying it was me who drew the card, like, bad luck.
A card game is a game of chance, right?
Yep.
There is a nuance here, though, for the aficionados on the Vietnam history, and I managed to get some help from John on this, that what you're alluding to in terms of many Australians going to war were drawn out of a birthday ballot with little wooden marbles.
That's
correct. It was a
correct.
lottery. And I checked on this because card here is not metaphorical. In this case, we're talking about someone here who actually volunteered amongst a group of mates, not the national lottery. They had cards in a hat, and only a certain number or something could get to go on the next group of volunteers. So these were actually people not being, in this case, they were not being drawn out of not being forced to go. He's alluding to the fact that they were playing cards in a hat, but the broader point is right, that essentially, this was a kind of game of chance as to whether you ended up.
So I'm glad you mentioned that because
I didn't appreciate
this
that
was
nuance.
the common interpretation of this was that this guy not unwittingly but was unlucky enough to draw the card. But what you're telling me is that he, in effect, was a volunteer.
Yeah, this was a group of volunteers who had to decide amongst themselves
Yes.
who would be next up, but they were willing.
Right. So this guy was in there by chance, but he actively was involved in himself putting his hand up, as it were,
Yeah.
by the act of playing those cards.
Yep. I mean, there were obviously a group of people who were motivated for whatever reason, like we saw in, previous conflicts and wars, to go on, and maybe it was ideas of sort of not letting mates down.
From 1965, Army units in Vietnam consisted of about 50% national servicemen and 50% regular Army. About 20,000 national servicemen served in Vietnam. Vietnam War Memorial, Canberra.
Yeah, that's a very significant point. It can really change your view of what some of the lyrics later on are actually alluding to if he was the one that ultimately chose to go.
I've obviously benefited from being able to have that insight from John Schumann himself, and so it's been very useful.
I'm going to have to reconsider some of my thoughts as we go, because that changes the tenor of a lot of what I thought about the song. Wow, and you're hearing it live here now. Okay.
Canungra and Shoalwater, obviously, you've got the jungle training camp Canungra in South Queensland. Shoalwater is a training north of Rockhampton.
In Townsville line the footpaths as we march down to the quay. This clipping from the paper shows us young and strong and clean.
And there's that Aussie accent coming through as Townsville line the footpaths.
I think that's a really powerful lyric. It was quite a thing to watch soldiers go off to war, wasn't it? I mean, historically, that's what people did.
Their average age of 21 makes them part of today's gear and go-go generation. But as soldiers, they hold to the traditions of their fathers, who fought in World War II, and of their grandfathers, the original diggers of World War I, who forged the Anzac legend more than 50 years ago.
And the same thing happened here. As they were going down to the quay, people lined up to wave them on. And they would have felt immense, the soldiers themselves would have felt quite proud, I guess.
And families seeing them
seeing them off. A pretty momentous point. They're about to leave home. They're about to leave Australian shores. And people are waving goodbye to them.
And the contrast here in the idea of young and strong and clean is, opposed to how broken they were following the war, right? There's
Absolutely.
youthfulness, there's a nostalgic sense. They're looking over a clipping from a paper, right? It's that sort of sense of nostalgia and pride. You can imagine it being in the family clippings where people put the great achievements. So pre-war, this sense, and I think then contrasting that with later, how sort of broken, I guess,
with what transpires.
Indeed. And I think nicely setting up maybe the distinction between pre-war Australia, pre-Vietnam acceptance of the necessity and contributing to something, and then we talked about how things had changed by the time of the early 70s and the sort of growing opposition to that, right?
Indeed. But the next line...
There's me in me slouch hat with me SLR and greens. God help me. I was only 19.
We hit a key moment in the song where he sets up the power of the concept for only 19. And just before that, him in his slouch hat with the SLR and greens, continuing on that nostalgic theme. Slouch hat, very iconic Australian image, both in image and a thing. SLR, anyone that's had any involvement with military history or even cadets, I dare I say, knows what an SLR is. Self-loading rifle, and green, the colloquial name of the uniform. But then it goes, God help me, I was only 19, and there you have the power of that self-reflection and the whole basis of the song.
And the SLR and the slouch hat and the greens and the young and strong and clean. It's
just a couple of thoughts on that. And this is universal. The whole point of military training, or a key point of military training, is to get a young man with all his energy and drive and need for fellowship and need to be part of the group and mould that into a particular purpose. And pride is an important part of that. The pride of being part of the group, the pride of looking after your mates or your fellow soldiers, and you wouldn't dare let them down. But more importantly, you would obey.
Mm-hmm.
You would obey. The whole point of military training is for young men to be ultimately, it sounds brutal, but to be utilised for an end, to be utilised to win a conflict. And there's a whole bunch of techniques, age-old techniques, they've been around forever, of moulding individuality into group effort. And here he's proud that he's part of this group. He's got his SLR, he's got his slouch hat, and he's going down and people are applauding, and the greens, and he's feeling pretty good about himself. And it's captured in a newspaper clip. And then he thinks, after all he's gone through, later on he's thinking back to this, and he's realising, oh my God, I was only set 19.
In World War II, the average age of the combat soldier was 26. In Vietnam, he was 19. In Vietnam, he was 19.
He set up beautifully how the feeling and the look and the vibe of the time, but as a songwriter or as a victim or whatever, or someone who later on is from the benefit of hindsight, from the pride, but then later the reflection.
Schumann is touching a universal theme here, where in good literature, where there's a contrast between the young, proud, excited man going off to war, being part of a group, and then facing the reality. And the reality is unspeakable. Yeah. And when he comes back, he is a changed man utterly, just as the character in Cold Chisel's song was a changed man utterly. In this case, perhaps even more so. It's extremely poignant, and it reminds me of great pieces of literature like All Quiet on the Western Front. And if some people have seen the recent make of that movie, it harks on those themes. Proud young men getting together, having a great time, joining the military, and then being marched off to the front, and the horror of that. And here we have it replayed again. Yep.
And musically, what I see here is this, the instrumentation around this early phase is that nostalgic and reflective and so on, and a little bit in between. It's not quite major minor, like that's part of the reason of that chord, is it's sort of got an ambiguity, the fact that people didn't know if it's a major chord or a minor chord. It's kind of setting up this reflective ambiguity. And then we see the instrumentation starting to lift, and then what we hear now is the kick drum enters like a little slow heartbeat, the boom, ba boom, and strings are coming in to reinforce the vocal. And suddenly, when we go to the next set of lyrics, we're off, because we're off from Vung Tau riding Chinooks.
From Vung Tau riding Chinooks to the dust at Newey Dat, I'd been in and out of choppers now for months.
So a little bit of context for listeners. The Australians were deployed to southern Vietnamese province of Phuoc Tuy. Newey Dat is an army base near the centre. Many Australian soldiers were at the Dat. It was their temporary home, and the port of Vung Tau is where they would take helicopters from. Choppers are obviously helicopters. So I guess this is a device to set up the journey, right? Now we're into the action.
Now we're into the action, exactly. And you can feel it, the way he sings it, the way, and through those lyrics. We've been in and out of choppers now for months.
Can you hear the violin trill here? And I did ask confirmation from John that was a deliberate attempt to reflect the motions of a chopper blade. The musical poetry is matching the lyrical.
Yeah.
And we made our tents at home, VB and pin-ups on the lockers, and an Asian orange sunset through the scrub.
Some lyrics here that really stand out for most people who know the song or resonate, I believe, Frank.
Well, I think absolutely. We made our tents at home with VB and pin-ups on the lockers. Victoria Bitter, a beer, Victorian beer, very popular, and Page 3 girls. These were 19-year-old blokes, and guess what? They had pin-ups of...
I thought they might have been maps or...
Oh, maybe they were maps.
Yeah.
Maybe they were diligently studying the terrain,
Yeah.
as it were. I don't think so. I think these were pin-up girls. I think you told me that this was confirmed by Mr. Schumann.
Yeah, that's right. There had been a debate about VB amongst the sort of general commentariat on the social media, but no, for sure, Victoria Bitter. And what is Victoria Bitter for people who don't know Australia? What sort of associations? No, but I mean, think about the VB, the famous song.
Archetypal beer, archetypal Australians. You need a drink at the end of a hard day's work. You've earned it. It's really, really enjoyable because there it is, and it's cold and it's great, and you're gonna, down a VB.
It's fair to say that song, the advertising song itself, is almost iconic. It went on for decades with little changes in the lyrics, had that very Australian accent.
Yes, that's true.
I'm trying to channel this, you get it working, you get it pulling milking a cow, you get it, driving a car, you get it digging it. In fact, I've got it now.
And I'm surprised that there was even debate about that, to tell you the truth. I mean, who are these?
Well,
are these people that didn't understand what a VB was?
I know,
really?
There was is it Victoria Barracks? Is it,
goodness me, guys, get with the program,
Exactly.
have a beer. And then he goes on to say, and an Asian orange sunset through the scrub. Now, I recall being really struck by that. And in my mind, imagining one of those hazy sunsets, a bit like the one used in Apocalypse Now, but also a bit like the ones that happen out west in Australia, where the sun just starts to glow and it's really strong. But the use of the word Agent Orange, Asian sounds a lot like agent. Mm-hmm. And that's going to become very important. We'll talk about Agent Orange later on. But right there in those lyrics, there was perhaps an unconscious link, a signalling of something.
Well, more than unconscious.
More than unconscious,
I've gone to the source of the songwriting himself, and he confirms it was quite deliberate. He's actually playing on this homonymic ambiguity.
Homonymic ambiguity. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you got that, because that emphasises even more how powerful this is. So this is very clever.
I think this is one of these lyrics that if you poll 50% of people, they're going to say it's Agent Orange, and there might be another 50, or maybe it's even less, who think it's Asian.
I've been stumbling over both agent and Asian talking right now, so yeah. I think you're right.
Well, it struck me as, that 13-year-old who had to perform this around the time of the Hawke government, as we talked about. Hawke approved Royal Commission, as we were talking about, into Agent Orange and the defoliants. Findings of that was somewhere around 1985. That was through my high school something that was in the ether, and it was Agent Orange almost became like a household term. Really, it just got such prominence through the political environment. And
well, I think that's absolutely correct. That the expression Agent Orange became, dare I say it, almost symbolic of a whole perversity in relation to the war.
And we'll hear other references to, I think, the effects of those chemical defoliants through the song.
Yep.
And I want to say a little bit more about that inquiry at some point. The next set of lyrics directly relate back to that.
And can you tell me, doctor, why I still can't get to sleep? Night time's just a jungle dark and a barking M16. What's this rash that comes and goes? Can you tell me what it means? God help me, I was only 19.
That build-up, and can you tell me, doctor, why I still can't get to sleep? So this tension is building up. Can't get to sleep, what's going on? And it evokes, again, that the PTSD effects of the war. The nighttime takes the veteran back, doesn't it, to the jungle,
and
the sounds of the machine guns. And that musical underscoring of that, of the barking, itself a great word, barking M16, underpinned by the drums,
snare
mimicking the sound of the barking and the bullets firing. And I have to say, that's another thing that sticks with me after all these years, remembering that pa-pa-pum sound, evoking the M16. And then he goes on to talk about the rash again. More of this, these problems that he's having, and how are they linked? What does it mean? Can you tell me, doctor, what it means? Right, this sense of impending worry and anxiety.
And that very much connects to some of the reading I've done of the Vietnam veteran experience. So, for example, a really great anecdote, I guess, was those who were going to see the doctors and they didn't have an answer for it, and the doctors tried their best and suggested, maybe your wife needs to change their washing powder because you're getting some reaction. And I don't think that was an attempt to diminish, but there was an official attempt to diminish by some forces, even commercial, in the sense that the Agent Orange inquiry involved many hearings in which a very persuasive, dominant lawyer representing a major chemical company, American chemical company, managed to be very effective in diminishing attribution of these effects on people to those chemicals.
Now, some might say actually gaslighting.
I think I read something from the Agent Orange inquiry final report, Justice Everett or his team essentially concluding Agent Orange is not guilty.
This is not a matter for regret, but for rejoicing. This is good news, and it is the Commission's fervent hope it will be shouted from the rooftops. Veterans have not been poisoned. The number with general health problems is small, probably much smaller than amongst their peers in the community. The few that have psychological stress disorder can seek help freely and without shame, and above all with hope of early relief and in the sure knowledge that no poisoning of their minds has occurred.
There's a strong parallel in there, I think, Frank, in this, if we compare and contrast the two songs. The Jungle Dark, it's a lovely little poetry there rather than Dark Jungle. Kesa, the telex riders clattered where the gunship once had been, the car parks make me jumpy, never stop the dreams. Here we have that direct comparison with, the nighttime being a jungle dark and the barking M16 and these things. So I think we've got that PTSD theme picked up in different ways in both songs. Just on the M16, I'm pretty sure that is the M16 machine gun, which were particularly American soldiers also were equipped with. But what's interesting also is M16, later we hear about the reference to mines. M16 was also the name of the anti-personnel devices that were laid down by Australians and Americans to defend that, particularly that region, yes. Australian soldiers. Yep. And those M16s, as we'll hear later, also became a significant weapon used back against Australians. So yes. I thought it was an interesting double play of the M16.
Absolutely.
I on a 4-week operation, when each step could mean your last one on 2 legs. It was a war within yourself, but you wouldn't let your mates down.
So notable there musically for that large snare hit. Sense of an explosion, perhaps? And then the strings, the staccato, giving the effect of what I see as maybe a soldier cautiously moving through and navigating through this jungle, right? A 4-week operation where each step, you get this sense of every little step.
Every step can mean your last one on 2 legs, right? So you could lose a leg through these landmines.
That's it.
And they knew it because they saw it, right? The guys on the ground. And they would have been hyper aware of that. I find the next line particularly interesting. It was a war within yourself. Obviously, they were in a physical war.
Yeah.
But it was also causing psychological warfare within themselves, turmoil. The psychological impact is intense, absolutely intense. And that leads to the PTSD and a range of other issues later on and at the time, of course.
Yeah, the triggering that they get by events when they return home.
Yeah.
They're in this heightened state of alertness and anxiety and always on and unable to switch off.
Yep, and we know so much more about all of that these days, about the effect of anxiety and the effect of your mind always being switched on, the effects of cortisol on the body, the effects of inflammation on the body, which leads to disease in a very, very broad sense. And highly central to the notion this was an event which was really going to impact on them.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't let your mates down till they had you dusted off. So you close your eyes and you thought about something else.
Dusted off. It's a military term, I think, from the US about the medical evacuation. So maybe something to do with the when the helicopter lands and the dust separating. But they're coming in to save people in the field who've been injured. And they were called Royal Australian Air Force dust-off pilots.
Dust-off crews. That was their radio call sign. Flew into combat, rescuing American servicemen and Vietnamese civilians alike. Over 11 years, more than 900,000 wounded.
In the midst of the firefight, his buddies put Hero on the rescue chopper.
Now, these veterans are eligible for the Congressional Gold...
So the image that comes to mind is as the helicopter slowly hits the ground, lands, these clouds of dust billow up around the helicopter, and then there's personnel running in and out of those helicopters, bringing in the wounded and whatnot. So what you're saying, Gareth, if I understand you, is that's referring to the dust-off is referring to that process of helicopters landing and taking and rescuing.
The dust-off pilots had no light and showed great skill in coming down. Vietnam War Memorial, Anzac Parade, Canberra.
There's some sound effects in the middle of this song that are in field, that sound like a helicopter, and if you isolate it, you'll hear things like contact, stand by, dust off. So it's a reference to contact is when you've engaged with the enemy.
Yep.
And the point is to signal to those elsewhere in helicopters whose job is to come in on standby, to come in to do the dust off, which is to collect the...
Yep.
And you wouldn't let your mates down till they had you dusted off.
Yes, and I find that a particularly poignant part of the song, that you wouldn't let your mates down. That particularly resonates with me because, as I said earlier, one of the whole points of military training is to form that bond. But in the Australian context, the bond is conceptualised more broadly by this idea of mateship. So you're there with your mates, and there is nothing that's going to stop you looking after your mates. And if you did, there'd be something awfully wrong. So mateship is such an important part of this whole conceptualisation of what was going on.
You wouldn't let your mates down until the point that you had physically been medevaced out.
Exactly.
Until you've basically, and you're unable, in a position where you're unable to actually help them. That's the point.
And it mimics, it echoes the American equivalent conceptualisation that no man left behind, right? And not to diminish mateship or any of that, but this is a pretty universal motif in military parlance, that you feel part of a group and they're going to look after you if things go wrong.
One of the events that may have slightly earlier, but more in the 60s, contributed to the argument or notion that we didn't really look after our Vietnam veterans was the case of a Victoria Cross winner, Kevin Wheatley, otherwise known as Dasher.
Yes.
He unfortunately died in the field, and at that point, this is the mid-60s, for some reason the Australian government refused to a pretty paltry amount to bring his body home, and that caused great alarm, more with our US allies and US military partners who I think helped in terms of a campaign to actually, so pretty astounding. And the government wouldn't budge on it.
And it's pretty astounding because it runs so counter to this notion of mateship, looking after your own, and the almost sacred commitment that governments give to look after the young men that as they go off to fight for their country. Right, and to possibly, give the ultimate sacrifice, as it's called. In other words, spill blood for their country, and yet here we have the situation of the government not even wanting to bring the poor bloke back.
And imagine
it took an American to shame the Australian military into doing something about it. Am I right?
Australian government into
the Australian government, of
into
course,
actually coughing up the money to repatriate. Yeah. And imagine how political suicide that would be now, in all these years later, in terms of where we've come on, in terms of the strength, the resurgence of Anzac Day and the Anzac Day legends, and our, the amount given to the War Memorial and respect for these things. It would be such a highly politicised issue.
I think that's absolutely right. There's something very fundamental about the understanding between a group of people, let's call it the state, and society, and the particular people that are asked to go off and potentially die for the country, die for the group, and the quid pro quo being that they'll be utterly respected and looked after when they come back.
Yeah.
That's almost a sacred bond. And if that's violated, I think that causes enormous social ructions.
Briefly, there was also the lyric, "You closed your eyes and thought about something else," which I think goes to the psychological need to shut out the horrors. So the deliberate self-censoring or veil or something in order to get through, right, which then leads later to those problems, as you would be well aware of, in terms of memories coming back and repressed and the psychological harm afterwards.
And then someone yelled out, "Contact front!" The bloke behind me swore. We hooked in there for hours. The God Almighty roar.
Yeah. And some bloke behind me swore. I think Schumann's being understated there. You can imagine what the person behind him would have said. I'm not going to repeat it, but everyone can imagine exactly what would have been said and screamed out at that point.
The huge hit of the snare drum there on the contact, to reinforce that sense of there's an engagement, there's a military engagement of some kind. Hooked in was a term of soldiers implying the need to hold a position in spite of their facing the enemy. The legitimacy of this, Frank, we talked about at one point, how this has been drawn on interviews of his brother-in-law and talking to other veterans, and he's gone to a lot of trouble to use the right terms.
Yes.
Right? And that would have been really important. It's not some pretender who's come along and thinks they can write about this experience that was so unique. Only vets would understand, right?
Yep.
So you wouldn't be you'd be going to the trouble of getting in the sorts of phrases and terms that people could respect.
So Schumann's gone to the deliberate trouble of ensuring credibility, and I think it pays off. It pays off in the quality of the song and its acceptance by a broad range in the community. In the community that may not have accepted someone like Schumann, a bit of a radical, a bit of a didn't he have a beard or something?
Was he going to be anti-war? Was he going to be?
Was he some sort of
pinko? He said he's a lefto,
pinko,
Como.
And yet here he writes this amazing song full of respect to the veterans. So I think that's highly significant.
He sort of somehow transcended the political spectrum, that, this wasn't just about left and right and anti-war and pro-war. This was a human
one
story,
could argue
right?
he stepped above that.
Frankie kicked a mine the day that mankind kicked the moon. God help me. He was going home in June.
Okay, iconic moment in iconic song?
I think it is an iconic moment in an iconic song. That sticks in your mind, just the allusion to the kicking the mine. This really resonated with me in the sense that he kicked a mine, and you know what that means. It means that he had landed on an anti-personnel mine, and that was either going to kill him or maim him. And it happened the day that mankind kicked the moon, i.e. 1969. And
July 20.
July 20. And you know what? I was in primary school that day in 1969, and we were all dragged in front of this black and white TV to watch the landing on the moon.
You gathered here today to see history in the making. Quite frankly, I never expected to see this, but you and I are now going to see these men from this lunar module actually step onto the surface of the moon.
So when I heard that, I had two images, one of the Vietnam War and one of man landing on the moon. And those two images have stuck with me forever when I hear this song. Those two images, one of a horrific war incident and another one of this momentous human experience of landing on the moon. And the author puts these two things together. I think that's so brilliant and so clever.
And when I mentioned about it being an iconic lyric, then you've got an iconic moment in 20th century history.
Yes.
With the moon landing, and then attached to this personal
tragedy.
Terrible tragedy. And there was a bit of cleverness here because this is based on real life events. The lyric, he was going home in June. Well, July was the moon landing, and so why was he going home in June but was still there in July? And it has a lot of people, deeply analysing that and trying to draw some meaning.
I admire your attention to detail there, mate, because I hadn't even thought of that. But now that you mentioned it, I guess it might be significant.
The social media chat groups were going a bit wild on that one. I was able to also have the chance to confirm with John, which he said in a number of interviews, that it was really the poetry. Not get lost by the technicalities like Caisson,
Yeah.
And in this case, it rhymed really well with moon. So
I think they're allowed poetic license. This is the thing about art and music, the poetic license. God help me, there's that refrain again. But this time, instead of saying, I was only 19, he adds more poignancy to it by saying he was going home in June.
He's written this song, but based on the eventual willingness of his brother-in-law to start to open up and address these things. So that's really a point
That's an incredibly important point, look, because the whole point about opening up is you can't heal unless you open up.
Yeah.
And it's the same, be it the individual or the nation.
And
the nation started opening up with that inquiry.
Yeah.
And it moved on to this sense of catharsis and healing nationally as well as personally, I'm sure, for a lot of Vietnam vets.
Yep.
Now, some of them didn't make it.
It took a long time to get there.
But it took a long time to get there.
Having dabbled a little bit in musical theory, and we're going back to referencing our previous podcast, if you recall, we talked about this idea of parallel fifths and how it goes back to sort of ancient song forms.
Ancient song forms.
And as unusual for contemporary music was, for a long time in classical theory, it was a no, you didn't do this. Now, John's not musically trained in theory and so on, so it was merely, I pointed this out to him, it was of interest, but certainly not intentional, that what happens there between the flute and the fiddle seems to be parallel fifths. It creates an ambiguity between whether it's major or a minor chord, because the third in the chord is what really determines whether you're in the major or minor.
Major or the minor, yep.
So you just got this ambiguity, which is part of that sense of the song and sad and pathos. And secondly, the interval of the fifth is actually at the heart of the last post motif. incredible that it's entirely unintended. It seems to really somehow fit with the song.
I'm really taken by that last thought, because if it's entirely unintended, the last post, one of the most powerful pieces of music about war written, and it's using that particular minor fifth, and coincidentally, here it's being used in this context.
And we hear it at the end as if like a bit of a bugle call. So underneath that also, Frank, is a bunch of sound effects which I've been able to separate out, and we'll be able to bring that up. The dust-off call-out. And this is where the radio operator who was actually in Vietnam, called Trevor Plow Morris, came in to add some of the effects. And we're hearing choppers and artillery, small arms and a jet fighter, and it's all layered up in the mix. In the middle of this is the dust-off call that we referred to.
This is 9-0. Dust off quick. Make our penny down in Minefield.
It's pretty buried, but there it is.
The sound effects make sense in terms of adding to the sense of war and coming out of that solo. More so the idea that Frankie, if you think about the lyrics, Frankie has kicked the mine, he's been injured, and the broader battalion, probably others, are very much harmed. And so this is the moment where, of course, the dust-off helicopter would be coming in.
And I can still see Frankie drinking tinnies in the Grand Hotel on a 36-hour rec leave in Vung Tau. And I can still hear Frankie lying screaming in the jungle till the morphine came and killed the bloody row.
Okay, a couple of sets of lyrics there, Frank, as we come out of the solo, and there's a reflection on what happened to Frankie.
The first thing that strikes me is that he's singing these, almost speaking them in a subdued voice.
Mm-hmm.
He's not out there shouting this. He's expressing this in a subdued voice. I can still see Frankie drinking tinnies, a very expressive reference to having a beer, tinnies, tin cans, very Australian.
Probably VB.
In the Grand Hotel on a 36-hour rec leave in Vung Tau. 36 hours is not a long time. And there he is trying to relax after that intensity of fighting in the war for 36 hours. And then he repeats that subdued, I can still hear Frankie screaming in the jungle. And the juxtaposition of the screaming in the jungle and drinking tinnies is really striking to me. Till the morphine came and killed the bloody row. The bloody row, I don't know what it means to you. To me, it links to the screaming, to the mayhem, to the complete nightmare that's happening at that point, and it was morphine that subdued it all. And morphine, as you know, is a drug which slows you down, sends you to sleep.
John Schumann confirms that too. He only had 3 syllables in that lyrical space, so bloody row for him evoked both blood, screaming, groaning of the wounded men, and the morphine was self-explanatory, killing that row, that noise, that the heavy-duty painkillers and so on. I'm struck by the way that you compared the imagery in the Grand Hotel. I hadn't thought of that actually so briefly after the fact that he'd been lying in the jungle and suffering so badly, but having to get strapped up and back at it, I suppose, or maybe not in this. Maybe the injuries in this case were so bad that wasn't possible.
And just one last point, this is probably a stretch, but the use of the word morphine, apart from the obvious fact that that's what they used, morphine's often used expressively to denote going to sleep. Morpheus, it's based on the Greek word for Morpheus, the god of sleep, heavily associated with the underworld. So there you have this allusion to this poor sod Frankie, who's screaming and groaning, and what makes it quiet? A bit of morphine.
Yeah.
Sleep, getting closer to the underworld.
There's interesting there, the flute and fiddle that are playing through this section underneath the vocal. You can compare them, and it's the same as what was under the solo part. So it's again like sort of a way of unconsciously, strengthening other musical motifs that we've heard.
The Anzac legends didn't mention mud and blood and tears, and the stories my father told me never seemed quite real.
Well, the Anzac legend, which has become such an important part of Australian identity was really being manufactured at this time. I recall this quite clearly, that in the 70s, Anzac Day was, it was a holiday, it was a national holiday. There'd be images on TV of troops marching down the street commemorating their mates. And then it became a stronger and stronger thing with the rise of nationalism in the 80s. And you just notice this continual references to Anzac Day, the importance of Anzac Day, an embodiment of the Australian spirit. And countries do this. They create a founding myth, a national myth of their identity. And Anzac Day became a very important one. But he's saying here, the Anzac legends didn't mention the downside, the mud and blood and tears. And not only that, the stories his father said seemed a little bit anodyne to him.
Yep.
I'm inferring from this that his father was following the script of the Anzac legend.
Which it
right, following the script, following the national...
sparing a youngster from this detail.
Perhaps sparing the youngster from the detail.
Or buried it or put it away psychologically.
Or emphasising the heroic nature of things.
Yeah.
So I think that's a very powerful and important part of the lyric of the song there, the references to Anzacs.
For me, hearing that in around early high school, right, this song's out, 1983, 1984, there was a play that we all read by the time I was in high school in 83, 84 called The One Day of the Year by Alan Seymour. It's a dialogue between like a grandfather or a father and son, and the son's coming along in the mid-60s or the early 60s and challenging the notions of this day where, from what he could see, people just got drunk and they were celebrating war. And that's all in the school curriculum, right, of people around the age of 13, 14 in Australia. And I can't help thinking that some of these motifs and ideas had an effect in terms of questioning of war and more understanding of its brutality. And actually, John Schumann himself, when I reached out to him, actually alludes to this play as something that he was really aware of because as a teacher, he had studied the play in school. Remember that song the band played, Waltzing Matilda, that we referred to? He felt there was strong parallels between, they were in the same mould, cut from the same cloth, about the degree to which they were really starting to reassess and question these legends of the elders, and really fundamentally challenge the legitimacy of the war.
We're sick of all the muck that's talked about this day, the great national day of honour, day of memory, day of salute to the fallen, day of grief. It's just one long grog up. It's a lot of old has-beens getting up in the local RSL and saying, well, boys, you all know what we're here.
Decent lot of blokes marching with their mates. 2 wars that represents. 2 wars you don't know nothing about. You jumped up little twerp.
I think that's it's interesting that had a profound effect on you. At the time, in my formative years, I guess I picked up a very anti-war sentiment, which I guess imbibed, internalised, that war was intrinsically bad. The notion that there might be a just war just seemed nonsensical. It's interesting because the just war theorem was talked about it earlier on, was developed through the whole Christian period. It was developed hundreds of years ago by the church. We're talking hundreds of years ago, and, they wrapped principles around it. How convenient to wrap intellectual principles around when it's okay to lead to this horrific situation.
Yeah.
So I was always very sceptical of that. And so when the anti-Vietnam sentiment broke out, it seemed very natural to me.
Yeah.
And so to hear this song reflect, in effect, an anti-war sentiment had a powerful effect on me when I first heard it, right?
But it was sort of anti-war but not anti-veteran.
Well, this is an important point. It was anti-war, but it recognised that having conceptualised war in abstract terms, it abstracted from the individual, it abstracted from the personal, it abstracted from the absolute horrific impact on the individual himself, herself. And this captures that beautifully. This and the Khe Sanh song. When we're talking about war, we are talking about people.
Yep.
So you can talk about whatever principles you like, but at the end of the day, when hundreds of people or even an individual dies, it's a horrific thing, and that gets lost.
And just to draw the connection across the two songs, we have the Anzac Legends, didn't mention Mud and Blood and Tears. In case we have There Were No Veto Heroes in 1973. So a very strong thematic parallel there.
I caught some pieces in my back that I didn't even feel. God help me. I was only 19.
So there's briefly there, obviously, the shrapnel associated with the mine going off that the author of the song was caught in his back, but he didn't even feel.
Didn't even feel. I think that's significant, both in the literal sense that he was so hyped up that he just didn't feel, as can happen with injuries, right? When you have a major accident, sometimes
adrenaline
you don't even feel the pain.
Yeah.
But it's also, I think, a reference to a psychological impact, something he didn't feel until much later on.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me, doctor, why I still can't get to sleep? Why the Channel 7 chopper chills me to my feet? What's this rash? It comes and goes. Can you tell me what it means? God help me. I was only 19.
He closes it out. So back to the reference to the doctor, PTSD, and all those sorts of anecdotes of vets, being triggered by events.
And he brings it all, he wraps it up in a really nice way, and I love how it all ends with that one note of the violin, just underlining the whole thing.
Well, I think that's the perfect fifth there, actually. With this, I think there's a violin and another instrument in unison.
Yes.
In the interval of the last post, that was, and just kind of ambiguity about it, right? Because it ends not on a clearly happy or clearly sad. It just
ends.
Yeah.
And to me, it going through this process of looking at these songs closely again, I just appreciated again how brilliant they are in capturing the music and linking it to emotions and social events that were happening at the time, and those two interacting to make really powerful songs. And both of them are really absolutely brilliant pieces of work, aren't they?
I feel like I've found a lot more just through the process of exchange with you of ideas and comparing different interpretations of lyrics and what they're throwing up in terms of different memories for us at different point. We're in different points in our lives and different places, but that's really interesting to me how you can have a slightly different interpretation that comes through that where the world you were in at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And you think about that multiplied hundreds of thousands of times, right, around the country, over time, and the power of these songs, because they're such powerful songs, they're doing it again and again and again. New generations coming through, and it's sort of almost no wonder that they become embedded in the national psyche.
So then we get to the iconic status, right? The iconic points that they've gathered over time.
They've gathered
broader legitimacy, but at the same time meaning a lot to individuals collectively, given legitimacy by, say, for example, the fact that, it's played on Anzac Day now, the Vietnam veterans, the RSL, it all brings it back. But I just I've got one more memory I wanted to throw in on about this final lyric, because this one was really resonant with me as a kid learning the song about why the Channel 7 chopper.
Yes.
The Channel 7 chopper flew over the MCG, the Melbourne Cricket Ground, on grand final day.
Ah, yes.
Right?
I recall
and you'd see in another great celebration of, I guess, national identity, is this incredible crowd in the 100,000 people maybe.
Coming to you live from the MCG. here in Melbourne. It is a magnificent day in Melbourne for football, and it should be a marvellous contest for two wonderful teams. First up, Hawthorn, who are looking to make it back-to-back victories.
Bigger than any stadium you'd find, even in the US. Like, there's no other place where so many people...
It's the Gabba, right? You're talking about...
No, Melbourne Cricket Ground, mate.
Oh, God,
Melbourne.
I've done it again.
Melbourne, mate, the heart of sport.
You'll cut that out.
The heart of sport. No, I think you were doing it on purpose to bait me. Yeah, over the Melbourne Cricket Ground. And you'd see, the excitement for, growing up in country Tasmania and footy, AFL, Australian rules football is pretty popular. And that day where, it's warm and you got the images of the helicopter flying over and seeing this massive crowd, and you're sort of full of imagery for me, because when I heard the Channel 7 chopper, I'm immediately like, oh, I get that. That was hovering over the MCG. And in 1982, maybe this affected the lyrics, but it was actually, the news helicopter actually crashed in a paddock on the South Gippsland Highway, killing 4 people. So maybe that all coming together had a resonance for me that, like, this Vietnam vet, when he hears that chopper, because, of course, in that South Vietnam, they were relying on moving around in the Iroquois helicopters all over the place, right?
That's right.
I got it, right? Because the Channel 7 chopper was this kind of iconic thing at age 12 or 13, right?
And quite by accident. I mean, obviously, Schumann couldn't have known that, but that's a really, really powerful point. And this notion that I guess was going through my mind, that the reactions that you and I had deeply to these songs, multiplied hundreds of thousands of times, helps transform these songs into icon status, something worthy of our, I use the term veneration, which in a very, very broad sense, something that we need to, I think, deserve our deep respect and recognition. And, they've both left an imprint on you and I, on countless others, and I think on Australian culture. And they've made musical history in this country, both of them. So they've both been influenced by our culture and in turn start to affect the culture as well.
And shape the political landscape.
So who would have thought you could get all of that out of 2 songs played on FM radio, I guess?
And I just also say that through deeper reflection into the song, I've learned a lot more about the war history. And particularly I was only 19 because I've discovered the depth of the references and gone back and found the historical books and learnt a lot more. That when I was a kid and I heard the song about the mine, oh yeah, that's obvious, someone kicking a landmine, right? But I didn't have the much bigger historical understanding, and I've gone back to some great history on the Vietnam War, for example, on the whole episode of the mining of that area in South Vietnam. This is where I mentioned that my late father had been ABC correspondent and been in some of that territory. The Viet Cong were very adaptive, and they were able to pick up these mines and dig them out of the ground without exploding them, and then put them in the way of Australians, and that was what he was.
And
this is the era.
In effect, repurposed them
and killing lots of Australians.
The enemy, as they against Americans and Australians.
Yeah,
and that, from memory, that was really embarrassing.
Obviously, got back into the politics in Canberra.
Yes,
I've really got to find a way to bring this anecdote in because you and I have served in Canberra, and I imagine that you probably had to appear more before the dreaded Senate committees and Senate estimates.
Yes, I remember them very fondly, Gareth. Anyway.
So imagine if you're preparing for the Senate estimates and the Department of Defence is thinking about the opposition's preparing some questions on the failure of this mining campaign, which was to defend Australians from Viet Cong coming south into the South Vietnamese territory, and then suddenly more Australians are dying per week probably from the mine than from actual being engaged in battle.
Yeah, this is highly embarrassing.
And I just got to read this, that how were they going to deal with this? What were going to be the talking points at Senate estimates to handle this inevitable line of questioning? The Army Secretary at the time was preparing for inevitable questions, and he had little doubt that the increase in casualties was due to the mines. However, he recommended to the Defence Department Secretary that parliamentary replies should make no mention of mines and attribute the increase in casualties to, quote, pacification tasks around populated areas. I mean, it's just, for me, the bureaucracy's brilliance that finding a way.
And for those that don't fully appreciate the role of a senior public servant, there it is to explain government policy and, in effect, to I won't say completely defend, but to explain to the best of your ability in a truthful way about what's going on with this government policy. And I guess there you have a very innovative and clever use of language and words.
Well, it's like corporate speak today, right? It's that sort of brushing over the actual reality of what happened, and it was a pacification task. It was friendly fire, I don't know, collateral, like terms that dehumanize, that help to explain away into. We see it everywhere.
We do see it all the time.
All right, but somebody at least sensible in the command in Vietnam, I think, wrote back and said, this is ridiculous. These statements prepared in Canberra are misleading and dishonest and incorrect, and it would be met with great ridicule in the press if used, because people basically knew it. The Viet Cong had removed mines. They were using it. It was common knowledge of everyone in the task force, including visiting press representatives. Sense prevailed, and there was no hiding of the story.
No, there's not. And it's interesting you mentioned that last interjection by the person in the command, basically doing their job and pointing it out. You're just going too far, people.
Calling it for the reality.
Calling it for the reality that was.
It wasn't really until I went off to the National Library and started, looking more into it, that suddenly out of that lyric about a mine and kicking a mine was a much bigger story, a political, military context of what was going on. So this has been great from that point of view, as the more you dig deeper, and I'm expecting everyone else out there to go to that depth of analysis here and finding parallels between Plato and Don Walker's lyrics. But by going through that, we hope that maybe we've helped to bring out and reinforce why these should be considered truly iconic. And, that's the end of our school debate.
All right. Yeah,
I rest the case for the affirmative.
Thanks, Gaz. On that note, see you later.
Thank you.
Southern Song.